Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome very much to the International Institute for Strategic Studies. The talk today is on China's internet, the balance between openness and security. It's one of the first of 5 presentations that my colleague Nigel Inkster, the Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk, will be holding over the course of the next few months, looking at various aspects of China's emergence as a cyber power. There's a Freudian slip to wrestle with. Today, China, like the United States and Russia, is one of the world's great cyber powers, with over 600 million Chinese connected to the internet, the majority on mobile devices. The leadership has plans for an advanced, informatized economy. It's a key element of its strategy to promote further growth and avoid the well-known middle-income trap. In pursuing this objective, China's leadership has sought to strike a balance between encouraging creativity and enterprise on one hand and maintaining social stability and political control on the other. Nigel.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nick. This series of presentations spun out of one that I did before the summer break, during which I sought to cover more or less the totality of China's cyber policies and strategies, and quickly realized that there was so much information to unpack here that the sensible thing to do would be to look at these discrete topics that are listed in the invitation. Having started, I now feel a little bit as if like one of these people who commits to running 7 marathons in 7 days. I'm beginning to wonder whether this was really such a good idea, but I'm committed to it now, and I'm kind of hoping that I'll make it through to the end. But just in case I don't, can I just make one point? Please do not resuscitate. I'm going to talk about openness and security on the Chinese internet. I'm not going to talk about some of these other topics like espionage, which occupies so much of the headlines. And I don't really want to take questions about that in the Q&A, because these will come more from the subsequent presentations, and I think we'll have enough to be going on with here. So I'd like to start by quickly the pre-internet era, and of course we're starting here with Deng Xiaoping's 4 modernizations, where informationization was not really explicitly mentioned, but was kind of implicit in what Deng was trying to do. But perhaps the first really significant intellectual input here that I would highlight is a book by Alvin Toffler. You've got to be an American with a name like that, haven't you? Called The Third Wave, which was genuinely very prophetic in terms of identifying the emergence of the information era and the transformational impact that this would have on all of our lives. And I can testify from having been in Beijing in the early 1980s that if you could give any Chinese a copy of Alvin Toffler's books, you had a friend for life. Chinese top leaders, Zhao Ziyang, Deng Xiaoping himself, are said to have read these publications, and they were very influential in forming thinking. Jiang Zemin, who went on to become president and chairman of the Communist Party, was in the mid-1980s Minister for Electronics Industry, and even then he was talking about ICT capabilities, as information communications technology capabilities, as constituting, I quote, the strategic high ground in international competition. The discrepancy between China's level and the world's advanced level is so great that we have to do our utmost to catch up. So already the perception was there that things had to change. And in the mid-1980s, we saw the Chinese Academy of Science invest in a company that ultimately became Lenovo, one of the biggest Chinese computer manufacturers in the world, recently bought up IBM. We saw CANET, academic network set up between Chinese universities. In 1992, the information economy was designated by the Chinese Communist Party as an important objective, and in 1994 the internet actually arrived in China, although it didn't become accessible to the public at large until 2 years later. The next period, really between about 1996 and 2000, was an exercise in laying the groundwork, during which period we saw significant investment in infrastructure, R&D centres, about 40 were established, and the establishment of many of the institutions that China needed to regulate the internet. And some of the key developments were the establishment of a state informatization leading group. It's much better in Chinese, 信息化, within the State Council, a 1997 National Conference on Informatization. By the end of the talk I've got this right, and the establishment of the Ministry of Information Industry as a key implementer of ICT related policies and strategies. And during the same period we saw many of the best known private sector corporations being set up by mainly returned Chinese students who'd acquired relevant experience in the United States. These included the Sohu and Sina.com web portals, NetEase, which was to provide email, Alibaba, which has just launched on the New York Stock Exchange, and Tencent QQ. We saw foreign, largely US ICT corporations and service providers setting up shop in China, and China rapidly becoming the global manufacturing center for ICT hardware and microprocessors. By 2003, China had become the world's third largest manufacturer of ICT. By 2004, the world's largest manufacturer of laptop computers and mobile phones. But as Greg Austin points out in his recent book, Cyber Policy in China, which I commend to you and which I've plagiarized shamelessly in my own presentation, the political and cultural aspects of China's Marxist-Leninist traditions, including the command economy and high levels of bureaucratization, meant that China still lagged behind the countries it saw as comparators, and if anything, during this period, the gap was growing. I think the year 2000 proved genuinely galvanic in terms of China's progress towards an advanced informationized society. In that year, China's Politburo determined that developing an informationized society would be a priority policy goal. A key driver in Politburo thinking was recognition of the changes being effected in China through the generation of ever greater quantities of information, and of the need to meet rising social expectations through greater transparency and accountability, and the realization that the internet and social media could be utilized to improve standards of governance with the aim of nipping social dissatisfaction in the bud has become one of the key aspects of Chinese leadership thinking about these capabilities, and has played a large part in their approach to information control and censorship, as I will come to in a moment. Jiang Zemin set the scene with a speech at the World Computer Congress in which he said, "Virtual reality is profoundly changing the way we produce, learn, and live. The speed and scope of its transmission has created a borderless information space around the world." He then goes on to say, "The internet also brings problems that make people uneasy, anti-science, false science, and information that is unhealthy to the point of being downright harmful." And I think the anti-science and false science is almost certainly a reference to the Falun Gong movement, which had shocked the Chinese leadership with its emergence the previous year. And the point about this speech was that though it was made at an international conference, it was very extensively portrayed within China's own official media. And in the ensuing period, a number of major institutional developments took place. These included the State Council Informatization Office, the CNCERT, China's Commuter Emergency Response Team, and the China Internet Society. And in 2000, China began a process, which it has continued ever since, of seeking the assistance of the World Bank in developing its information strategy, which has resulted in a series of frank and hard-hitting reports which identify the shortcomings of existing Chinese policies. And the most recent of these, China 2030, identifies a challenging to-do list that has to be implemented if China is to achieve its objectives of becoming an advanced informationized society. The following year, the 10th five-year plan identified informatization as a strategic priority. And in 2004, the Communist Party Central Committee published several opinions on strengthening the exploitation and development of information resources, the key element of which was the statement that these processes should henceforth be led by market forces. I think that is very significant. And this period of relative liberalization was reinforced by the 2006 National Informatization Plan, which, amongst other things, placed emphasis on developing a series of laws governing the cyber domain. And during this period, the contours of the modern Chinese internet were becoming firmly established with the emergence of service providers, including the search engine Baidu, the online marketing site Taobao, and the video services Tudou, Youku, and the microblogging site Sina Weibo. And these developments were accompanied by an extensive array of government initiatives in areas such as e-government and e-commerce, and by a continuing push under the direction of then Premier Wen Jiabao to promote open government and to use the internet and social media to expose government corruption and malpractice. And this aspect of policy was highlighted in China's first white paper on the internet, published in 2010, which spoke of the right to free speech, access to information, and the public's right to exercise democratic supervision over government. The white paper contains the following statement: the leaders of China frequently log on to the internet to get to know the public's wishes and sometimes have direct communication with netizens to discuss state affairs and answer their questions. And if that wasn't evidence enough, it was possible shortly thereafter to watch a video clip of President Hu Jintao sitting at a workstation next to a pert and pretty young Chinese journalist, sending a message to China's netizens, as they became known, and answering some of their questions. It was scarcely an Oscar-winning performance, but the fact that it took place at all, I think, was significant in a society that significantly values this kind of gesture. In the same year, we saw the establishment of an online bulletin board entitled Direct Line to Zhongnanhai, which was established to enable citizens to communicate directly with the top leadership. And around the country, police forces set up their own microblogs, an example being Safe Beijing, which encouraged ordinary citizens to communicate with the police. And although this assertion risks eliciting hollow laughter from those who are inherently skeptical both about China's commitment to the rule of law, perhaps better in the Chinese context referred to as rule by law, the Chinese government did in this period do a great deal to strengthen legislation relating to things like IP protection and the right to privacy. In December 2012, the NPC Standing Committee published Principles of Internet Privacy, which were translated into regulations issued in July 2013 by the Minister of Information Industry Technology, with the aim of applying international standards of data protection and with sanctions that included fines and even criminal penalties. And these mechanisms for determining and implementing informationization policies have continued to evolve, and if anything, show greater leadership focus on this as a strategically vital issue. In 2013, the leading small group on cyber policy and informatization, headed by President Xi Jinping, was set up, with the State Internet Information Office, the Wang Xinban, which has been set up a couple of years earlier to oversee the implementation of Internet policies, serving as its executive office. And this makes the State Internet Information Office a very powerful entity now bureaucratically within China. And the division of labour here is that the State Internet Information Office sets and oversees the implementation of policy, while the Ministry of Information Industry Technology is actually responsible for the practicalities of implementation. So, the next thing I want to talk about is technology and the phenomenon of indigenous innovation. By the year 2000, China's ICT sector was growing at twice the rate of the rest of the economy, and this at a time when China was regularly posting 10 to 12% annual GDP growth. Most of this capability took the form of foreign direct investment or start-up activities by young Chinese returnees. Actually, interestingly, during this period, the state-owned element of the Chinese ICT sector fell by roughly half, with a corresponding increase in private sector engagement. China was well on the way to becoming the world's largest ICT manufacturer, but there was already a powerful imperative to move up the value chain to avoid the risks of the middle-income trap. And China's leaders were aware that it would take far more than mere manufacturing capabilities to achieve their ambitious objectives of an advanced informationized society. The approach adopted was one that was sequenced, with an initial focus on building the infrastructure that would form the basis of further developments. But there was also recognition, highlighted in the series of World Bank reports that I referred to earlier, that China would need to transform its higher education system and its approach to research and development. And as a result, we saw a series of major initiatives designed to create an enabling environment for China's informatization. A legal and policy infrastructure was laid out to facilitate the partial privatization of China's telecom sector and the establishment of a domestic ICT industry. Some sectors of the economy, particularly finance and banking and agriculture, received particular attention, and a substantial effort was put into initiatives to foster what was being termed indigenous innovation through tax incentives and administrative and legal measures designed to encourage the filing of patents and set higher standards of intellectual property protection. But one of the key shifts that needed to take place was in the area of higher education. In 2000, China's education was nowhere near adequate to produce the skilled workforce it would need to realize its ambitions. Spending on education was about 2.5% of GDP. Participation in tertiary education just around 11%, and the number of PhD candidates in the country as a whole was tiny, never mind those very few that were taking doctoral studies in information technology. The ensuing decade witnessed a transformation, resulting in a quadrupling of PhD students, a doubling of tertiary education institutes, and a massive expansion of Chinese students enrolling in university courses overseas. The 2010 National Plan for Medium and Long-Term Education Reform and Development sets the strategic objective of, I quote, rejuvenating the country through science and education, making the nation strong by relying on talents and professionals, running education to the satisfaction of the people, and building a rich resource of human talent. But the barriers to achieving this were and are formidable. The story about growing numbers of Chinese graduates obscures important issues of quality in China's education system and about the pervasive nature of bureaucratism within China's universities. A fact registered by the Chinese Communist Party Central Commission in 2013 when it spoke inter alia of the need to, quote, smash administrative dominance in China's universities and R&D culture. And it remains the case that despite all the considerable efforts made by China's leadership to turn around this supertanker, China's R&D sector continues to suffer from a top-down, bureaucracy-driven approach, with the universities in particular still dominated by political ideology and bureaucracy to a degree that encourages conformism, conservatism and placemanship, and fails to encourage independence of thought and a willingness to pursue knowledge wherever it may lead. More broadly, the social and cultural factors in China that would make for a culture of genuine independent inquiry are still weak. And Chinese ICT companies which do attempt to innovate, and we should not lose sight in this context that companies such as Huawei, ZTE and Tencent are now annually filing large numbers of patents, complain that their efforts do not receive the recognition and support they deserve. An August 2014 article in the China Financial and Economic National News Network lists a litany of complaints by China's indigenous ICT sector, which include pressure from US competitors and discrimination against Chinese companies in international markets, predictable enough, but also a taxation structure that continues to privilege foreign companies and a downright unwillingness by Chinese official entities to purchase indigenous products, even when these are competitive, because these entities are so heavily invested in foreign systems. The other major driver for indigenous innovation in China has been a constant awareness of both the security vulnerabilities of virtually total dependence on foreign, in effect US-designed ICT products, and the potential that the Internet has to serve as a vector for subversive ideas. And these perceptions have only been strengthened by the Snowden revelations, which have been widely, but incorrectly, interpreted as enabling the USA and its allies to have virtually total visibility of Chinese communications. The term prison gate in Chinese Langjingmen has now entered the Chinese lexicography and can be read in many newspaper articles. As early as 2006, the State Council's Medium and Long-Term Guidelines Programme for Science and Development had identified reliance on foreign technology as a threat to China's economic and national security. Starting in 2009, successive efforts have been made to build indigenous innovation into state ICT procurement programs and to develop indigenous technical standards to exercise more effective sovereign control over ICT. Now, this, of course, has raised concerns from foreign manufacturers and suppliers about discrimination and threats to IPR protection, and has raised questions about whether China's objective is really to achieve digital autarky. Those Chinese scholars and experts with whom I have discussed this are unanimous in affirming that this is not the aim, and that China cannot and does not want to wall itself off from the outside world. These scholars argue that while China does need to develop its own technological capabilities to eliminate vulnerabilities, it is prepared to continue to accept foreign technology provided it can be confident about issues of transparency and security, and points out that their concerns are in these regards no different to those expressed by Western governments about Chinese ICT products such as those of Huawei. They also point out that under WTO guidelines, it's possible to distinguish between ends, in this case an internet in whose security and integrity China can have confidence, and means, which can include limiting foreign production to achieve that end. To achieve that end. The other areas of concern to China's leadership from a security perspective is the risk that loss of control of information flows within China will lead to a loss of political control. And this concern has, as pointed out at the beginning, been a key factor in determining the evolution of China's Internet. In 1994, the year the Internet became formally established, regulations on security and computer information systems were promulgated, giving the Ministry of State Security responsibility for policing China online. In 1997, the Computer Information Network and Internet Security Protection and Management Regulations, sorry, these are all a bit of a mouthful, approved by the State Council, listed the following categories of information whose transmission was banned. Information that constituted incitement to resist or break the Constitution, laws, and implementation of administrative regulations, inciting the overthrow of the government or the socialist system, inciting division of the country and harming national reunification, inciting hatred or discrimination against national minorities, disseminating falsehood, distorting the truth, spreading rumours and disrupting social order, promoting feudal superstitions, sexually suggestive material, gambling, violence or murder, promoting terrorism and inciting others to engage in criminal activities, insulting and slandering people, injuring the reputation of state organizations, and other actions which go against the Constitution, laws, or administrative regulations. Rather reminiscent of a Ming Dynasty legal ordinance that I once came across, which effectively said, don't do what you shouldn't. Right. External control, as all of you probably know, is filtered through the Golden Shield project, which was introduced in two phases, 1998 to 2006 and 2006 to 2008. And Golden Shield, otherwise known as the Great Firewall of China, uses IP blocking, domain name system filtering, URL filtering, packet filtering, and SSL man-in-the-middle attacks to prevent unhealthy content from entering China through one of the country's international internet exchange points. Chinese residents wanting to bypass Golden Shield have largely been able to do so by joining virtual private networks. But latterly, pressure on these and other systems, such as online libraries, text messaging applications, and cloud computing services, and systems such as Google Drive, have been increasing. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that all Google services have been coming under increasing pressure in China since last year. In addition to Golden Shield, content control within China has been achieved through an initiative by the Chinese Internet Society to sign up Internet service providers voluntarily to police their own networks and services, and by efforts, as yet not fully realized, to require all online users to adopt real identities. And large numbers of state employees, according to one estimate 2 million, have been engaged at all of China's administrative tiers in monitoring and filtering the microblogging content that makes up so much of China's contemporary online communications. And the efficacy of these efforts is illustrated by a study of the main Chinese microblogging service Sina Weibo, which showed that 30% of messages deemed to have unacceptable content were deleted within 5 to 30 minutes of posting, and that 90% were deleted within 24 hours. Example of the kind of deletes that occur can be taken from commentary on Hong Kong's recent protests, with terms such as Hong Kong, barricades, Occupy Central, and even Umbrella being deleted, as well as a photograph of Xi Jinping carrying an umbrella. At the same time, 2013 saw many so-called Big V accounts, microbloggers with significant numbers of followers, in excess of 600, being closed down. And this has been accompanied by a move away from the use of Weibo towards greater use of WeChat, a Facebook-like messaging system that enables messaging between self-selecting groups and is a phenomenon no doubt seen by the authorities as much less of a challenge to social stability and cohesion. And Western reporting of these arrangements often portray them as a limitation of freedom of speech to a degree which is not, in fact, the case. A recent exercise in which a group of foreign researchers set up their own social media network in China, thereby gaining access to censorship software, documentation, and customer service help desks, discovered that, and I quote, criticisms of the state, its leaders, and their policies are routinely published, whereas posts with collective action potential are more likely to be censored, regardless of whether they are for or against the state. An example of the kind of post that gets through the net is as follows. The Chinese Communist Party made a promise of democratic constitutional government at the beginning of the War of Resistance against Japan. But after 60 years, that promise has yet to be honoured. That China today lacks integrity and accountability should be traced back to Mao, and intra-party democracy, as talked about today, is just an excuse to perpetrate one-party rule. The outlines of what Rebecca McKinnon has characterized as networked authoritarianism, in effect an authoritarianism that recognizes that in the information era people will have access to lots of information and will be able to express heterodox views and to exploit this by making a virtue of necessity, are now pretty well established. And they've been visibly tightened following Xi Jinping's accession to the top leadership position in 2013. I think this is a reflection of Xi's distinctive leadership style, which has reversed the trend towards collective leadership, with Xi accumulating much higher levels of personal power, whilst at the same time pushing back against moves towards political liberalization. At the same time, Xi has initiated economic policies that emphasize the leading role of the market and the importance of strengthening China's legal system. What ultimately that will mean in terms of how China's internet functions and develops remains to be seen. To sum up, over the course of the last 20 years, China has evolved into a society that has a full suite of modern ICT capabilities. These include an extensive national network, the existence of national ICT champions that are beginning to have global impact, and a China that is using its position as a global manufacturer of ICT components significantly to influence global technical standards. Levels of research and development are increasing rapidly, as is the number of graduate and postgraduate students qualifying in computer science and information technology. And domestic service providers, including search engines such as Baidu, microblogging services like Weibo, WeChat, and the eBay equivalent Taobao, have contributed to the creation of a vigorous and distinctive online culture, which has been achieved partly by excluding Western competitors, but also by ingenious adaptation of online services to accommodate Chinese cultural preferences. But I think the key factor in all of this, and I cannot emphasize this too strongly, has been this relentless determination by successive generations of Chinese leadership to drive this process forward, and in doing so, to be willing to take significant risks by favouring policies that actually promote openness. I don't believe that this reality is sufficiently appreciated in the Western world, where the dominant narrative around the internet has always been one of individualism and the salience of private enterprise. On the debit side, there's still an awful long way to go before China achieves its ambition of becoming an advanced informationized society. Infrastructure is still patchy, particularly in rural areas. The legal infrastructure remains patchy both in its existence and its implementation. And the focus on social control through internet monitoring and filtering means that there are relatively few resources devoted to areas such as cyber criminality and indigenous IP theft, which remains a pervasive phenomenon. But more specifically, achieving an advanced informationized society is about far more than just developing technical capabilities. And the same is true for cybersecurity, which is about far more than just integrity of the supply chain. We appear to be at a point where ICTs are maturing to the point where further developments are likely to be incremental rather than transformational, rather as has been true of automotive technology over the past century. Modern cars and cars built 100 years ago are at once very similar and very, very different, and I think this is the area that we are looking at now with ICT. In this world, the prizes are going to go to those who are able to integrate ICT most effectively into other areas of activity and leverage the benefits that ICT can deliver. And here, two enemies need to be overcome: bureaucratism and trust. And we've talked about bureaucratism already. And I'll finish here, I would refer you to the thinking that drove the late Dr. Joseph Needham to begin his history of Chinese science. And this was his puzzlement at how it came to be that China, a society that for most of recorded human history had been characterized by an impressive record of scientific and technological information that had put it civilizationally far ahead of most other states, had somehow stalled around the 15th century. Why did this happen? And his conclusion was that increasing bureaucratism and a resultant culture of intellectual conformity had created what was in effect a disabling culture for further scientific and technical process. And this, as I think I hope I've made clear in what I've just said, is something that China's current leadership is acutely aware of. But it remains to be seen whether a political system that does not permit certain things to be questioned can overcome this and give rise to a culture which will always allow thinkers to follow the facts without fear of bumping up against ideological barriers. The other issue is one of trust. I think it's probably no accident that the internet was established first in the USA, in many ways the ultimate high public trust society. China, by contrast, is a society characterized by very low levels of public trust, which is understandable enough given its recent history. And social scientists typically identify one of the key contributors to high public trust as the prevalence of civil society groups, something that the Chinese Communist Party has only recently and grudgingly begun to tolerate within very limited parameters. So I think it's possible to imagine circumstances in which China's digital development might stall, even go into reverse. But I personally doubt it, and I think we would be extremely ill-advised to assume that just because China does things differently from ourselves, this will somehow prevent them from achieving their objectives. For China's leadership, the stakes are as high as they possibly can be, and I would expect them to carry on driving forward with their informatization plans, no matter what the risks. Thank you. Sorry, I took longer than I planned.
Oh, thank you very much. We have about 23 minutes left for questions and discussion. I'd ask you please, I would issue a reminder for those who are here at the start and also those who came in subsequently, this is not the session to be asking about cyber espionage or cyber war. Please keep your questions, your discussion points within the bounds of the talk for today. First person to twitch the hand, you sir, please.
Jonathan Castalbo. I was just wondering, many of the breakthroughs that are anticipated by Google are in artificial intelligence, and they've invested massively in that. I know that some Chinese company has invested in an artificial lab in San Francisco. What is their thinking on the Chinese thinking on artificial intelligence and where their industry is going? Do you think that are there sort of freedom issues here? You spoke about bureaucracy. What is their thinking on it, and what do you think? Is this going to be an impediment for them?
No, I think quite the reverse. I think that this is one area where the Chinese setup actually may work in their favor. I think there is a very powerful commitment to determination, again by China's leadership, that China should be on the cutting edge of artificial intelligence investment. They've been working on this for some time. One of the people that I had an interesting conversation with a couple of years ago from the Chinese Academy of Engineering spent 4 years in Edinburgh in the 1980s studying artificial intelligence. So this is a topic that China has been taking very seriously for a very long time, and looking at it in all sorts of different areas, much the same as everybody else. That artificial intelligence has enormous potential in areas like, for example, medicine. There are many forms of medical intervention that a machine can probably do rather better and more reliably than fallible human beings. There are just sort of so many areas where artificial intelligence has the potential to be transformational, and China is determined to develop expertise, and not just expertise but leading edge expertise in these capabilities, and I'm confident we'll do whatever it takes. And actually, in some respects, I think some of the hand-wringing ethical considerations that one tends to encounter in the West, areas like, for example, autonomous weapon systems, are less likely to be considerations within the Chinese scheme of things.
Hi, Rich Mendelsky. Thank you, Nigel. Wonderful presentation. One comment you made about the Chinese performance of engaging with netizens struck a chord, because we reminded of Medvedev, who also set up a website in Russia. Citizens could petition, he would personally respond and deal with cases, and this was a very beautiful show. But also the success of these kinds of surrogates or virtual democratic processes would actually obscure real democratic processes. So to what extent is the performance by Chinese officials who engage directly with citizens, who respond to them, who actually solve problems, a replacement for actual petitioning that should go through legislators or through official means? Is it to evade it, or is it?
No, I think the intention is genuinely to improve performance, and the Chinese Communist Party has become the ultimate learning organization. They spend an awful lot of time reviewing their performance, reviewing their behaviors, and the spectre hanging over their heads that drives all of this is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the imperative to avoid a repetition in China. So the recognition is there that responsiveness to popular concerns and effective delivery is critical for the Chinese Communist Party's continued survival, and they are prepared to use whatever means they can devise to improve performance. And the Chinese central leadership, who know perfectly well that their provincial and county level bureaucrats are often corrupt, indisciplined, hard to control, and unaccountable, need as much external pressure as can be applied in order to limit their misdemeanors and improve their performance. And one of the key things that the Chinese central leadership looks to the information revolution to deliver is more reliable statistics about what's actually happening within the country, because they know the ones that they are sent by their bureaucrats are works of fiction, and they need to devise other techniques to find out what the real story is and what is really going on. So is it the case that Xi Jinping is spending an hour a day at with a laptop responding to the concerns of Chinese citizens? Well, of course not. There's no way that would happen, but this is not the point. The important thing is the symbolism of the gesture. The fact that at one point, the chairman of the Communist Party and the president of the country did this is meant to send a message to everyone else that this is the way to go. So I'm in no doubt that this is a very serious proposition. I think they recognize that it's not the whole story. There've got to be other ways of improving delivery and responsiveness, but I'm in no doubt that the Chinese leadership see this as a vital component in their toolkit.
Yes, sir.
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese freelance journalist. Alibaba, as you said, now has stockholders abroad, and so
Sorry, I didn't.
Alibaba
Yeah,
has
yeah.
a stockholder abroad, and so there are conflict of interest abroad, internal relation between Communist Party and Alibaba. And how do you evaluate in the future the confrontation is controlled or out of control?
Well, I think that I think that to the extent that there is any conflict between an entity like Alibaba and the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party is going to win. Well, I think the interesting thing about Alibaba, in particular the flotation on the New York Stock Exchange, was that it happened on the New York Stock Exchange and not as originally intended in Hong Kong. And the reason it didn't happen in Hong Kong was that Hong Kong's regulators were unhappy about the lack of transparency in the governance mechanisms of Alibaba, and therefore refused to allow it to float on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. And Chinese scholars that I have talked to say that for China as a whole, this is a matter of shame that Alibaba was not seen as being in a fit state to float on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. It should have been.
Yes, please.
David Nordell, you've referred in various ways to the conflict between the desire that's being implemented to improve the efficiency of delivery of services, to improve responsiveness to public concerns and so on, and on the other hand the desire to repress any kind of dissent against the system. Do you identify any kind of real dialogue within the political leadership about how far can we go, how do we balance this act according to different circumstances, or in general? Is there some genuine policy discussion in China about what's the right way to handle this, because we're riding a tiger that may possibly eat us if we're not careful?
The answer is that behind the scenes there always has been, and there continues to be, very high levels of debate and discussion about how far to go. Unfortunately, I think this has led to a series of false dawns for those who harbour the conviction that ultimately China will have to come out with its hands up and become a model Western-style democracy. And I think some of the things that Prime Minister Wen Jiabao was saying 3 or 4 years ago about democratization perhaps feed some of these I consider unrealistic expectations. But is there a vigorous debate going on within, for example, the Chinese Communist Party school about how far and in what direction political reform needs to go? Hell yes. Entire forests have been destroyed in efforts to determine what the future direction should be. And what we've seen, I think, as I mentioned very briefly, when Xi Jinping took over as chairman of the Communist Party and president last year, quite a significant sea change away from a trend towards greater or a willingness to contemplate greater political liberalization, towards a much greater insistence on the continued dominance of the Chinese Communist Party, and a conscious and very deliberate rejection of some aspects of universal values, human rights, etc., etc. This has been, this is not covert. This has been quite explicit, and I think that, there is a conundrum that I don't think any of us can entirely explain here, which is what Xi Jinping doing a means to an end, or is it an end in itself? Does Xi Jinping envisage a situation in which a more economically prosperous China, more at ease with itself, more comfortable in the world, can eventually relax the controls? Or does he envisage a China which is always going to be run by the Communist Party operating on Leninist principles? And I think we just don't know the answer to that question.
Yes,
Which gets me to another point. The suspicion is, the popular suspicion, in the West, is that ultimately China desires to use ICT and hence has stressed this for control. And it's a way, it's a very effective way of control, and ultimately it's setting up of this parallel universe will allow them in time to cut themselves off. You say they don't want to become autarkic, but there are probably some people in the Communist Party in China who say let's go for it, however impractical it is. Although, as you say, there's considerable debate, even on the state council within the party and in the bureaucracy on this. But the development of all the indications are the state is behind some of these developments. You've got to get bank credit from a state bank, and ultimately that could be the CP that's behind it. They're setting up this parallel universe in every field of ICT, and they'll use artificial intelligence to control things. You can't rule out the possibility if it should become necessary for them, if reform runs away with itself. What are your comments on that?
Well, I mean, that is a hypothesis. We have no way of knowing whether that is how events will play out. But I think that, to my mind, presupposes that China can isolate and quarantine itself from wider global political currents and economic currents in ways which I just do not think are any longer realistic. I think China, the reality is that China is increasingly entangled with the rest of the world and with major global developments. And I think that the Chinese leadership are resigned to that reality. They recognize that reality. And the idea that they can somehow withdraw and create a kind of freestanding sinosphere, I'm not aware of anybody serious within Chinese academic, intellectual or political circles who is arguing for that option. I'm just not aware. This is something that is being contemplated. I mean, here in the United Kingdom, we've got UKIP, which seems to be arguing for something rather like that. I'm not aware that there is a Chinese equivalent of UKIP.
Okay, but you could say that they want. It's also a mechanism, to use cliches, to delay reform, to buy the politicians' time, isn't it?
Yeah, but I just don't think. I just don't think that anything that about the experience of the last 20 to 30 years would support that contention. The whole driver of Chinese reform since the end of the Cultural Revolution has been, effectively encapsulated in Xi Jinping's concept of the China Dream, which is, when boiled down to its essentials, the depiction of an end state which feels very similar to the sort of thing that we've got in the United States, in Western Europe, in Japan. I don't think they're trying to set up the Klingon Empire.
Sam Dilly, you mentioned e-government earlier on. What you did mention was any transactional services with the citizen that there might be. China looking down that route to the FBI, how they're going to encourage digital take in the rural Have you got some
Yeah.
plan for that?
Well, I mean, the potential of ICT to transform China's rural areas has been identified very early on. And I think some of the low-hanging fruit has already been gathered in terms of providing China's farmers, with much better information about market conditions, making available the latest knowledge and technology about agricultural techniques, use of fertilizers, all that sort of thing, and also promoting rural education. But there is a lot more that could be done. There is still a lot of excess labor within China's countryside that needs to be mopped up, redirected, and the government is aware of the potential for ICT to help with that. They haven't quite got there yet. At the other end of the spectrum, there is this ambitious initiative for smart cities. The intention to develop a network of cities that are very intensively ICT enabled, ecologically friendly, and where ICT is used intensively to deliver services and to facilitate everyday transactions. The sort of model that people have in mind is Estonia, where the government delivers all services to its population online. And this is a sort of this sort of model, whilst ultimately might be something that they would aspire to throughout the country. Obviously the cities are an easier place in which to do it, and I think that's where the focus is going to be. But again, the focus is on more effective delivery, the elimination of corruption, which Xi Jinping has majored on since taking office, and the potential of e-government to minimize corrupt behaviors is something that China's leadership is acutely aware of. And they definitely want to leverage the benefits that they can get from this. Yes, please.
Nigel, you talked about the old option under previous dynasties, even of conformity versus innovation. But from what you're saying, it sounds like that's no longer an option. But is it perhaps more a question for the Chinese leadership of how fast and how, rather than saying, let's go back to the old ways of burning knowledge, cutting ourselves off, because nobody can do that anymore. And you've been talking about the objectives, but isn't this actually another set of dilemmas for the leadership?
Well, of course it is, absolutely, and they themselves recognise that. But I am in no doubt that they are clear about where they want to go and how they want to get there. And the question is, at what pace can they go, and how quickly and effectively can they eliminate some of the major barriers to doing it. And also, of course, there is implicit in all of this, can they get over the final hurdle to the point of creating a society where people aren't afraid to follow the facts where they lead, not worried about bumping up against ideological limitations. And I think this becomes increasingly important as the direction of travel for ICT is about integration into every aspect of life. To the point where talking about ICT as a kind of separate issue almost becomes redundant, because this is what we're looking at. And of course, where are the new frontiers with ICT? It's about data aggregation, data storage, but not just data, it's information and critically knowledge. And it's what you do with the knowledge that is what really adds the value. So creating a culture in which people are comfortable with allowing freedom of knowledge, if you like. I prefer freedom of knowledge to freedom of information in this context, is going to be the critical challenge. And I suspect, as has always been true with China, we will see setbacks. In the early 1980s, China's leaders were reading Alvin Toffler, Third Wave. You remember, you were there with me. We used to go around dishing these things out to everyone who emerged. at the same time, we had the campaign against spiritual pollution, where we saw everybody, out of their newly fashionable garments back into blue cotton, and not exactly waving little red books, but being, behaving in ways very similar, reminiscent of the Cultural Revolution. So I suspect there will be, an element of stop about this. But I don't think China will be. I don't think China will be the only place where this happens, but it will matter more with China because of China's global throw weight.
Okay. The last question? Yes, please.
You've talked a lot about the Great Firewall and about various ways in which the Chinese government is trying to prevent the dissemination of dangerous information or dangerous ideas. Within this context, is there any attempt to prevent either the import or the indigenous development of new technology solutions, including encryption, that would make it more difficult for the government to actually keep an eye on what's going on or prevent its dissemination?
I think the Chinese government are going to make sure that whatever happens, they're going to be able to get access to the encryption capabilities that they need. And I think that they will simply make this a basic condition of foreign service providers operating within China. Fine, you can come in, but we need your key material. And now, of course, with certain forms of technology, this, for example, you have the phenomenon of double encryption. The data transmitted on this device is encrypted, but the device itself is encrypted, and the manufacturer does not have the key. These things, can be quite well protected in ways that present a significant and growing challenge to signals intelligence agencies. There's nothing much that China can do about that in terms of the iPhone that you bring into China and use for your own communications. But I'm pretty confident that in terms of indigenous manufacture, the Chinese government is always going to be able to want to ensure that it will be able to get access to whatever systems are produced indigenously. Now, this is not perfect. If you go to China and you want to log on to the BBC website, you can't. But if you've got the BBC app on this, you can. So there are always gaps, there are always ways around. And actually, the Chinese government doesn't really care if you get onto the BBC English language website. It's the Chinese one that they want people not to get onto, and that is subject to a rather more rigorous controls. So I think it's always going to be a cat and mouse game. This is just in the nature of these technologies. Western signals intelligence agencies are now starting to struggle with the fact that since the Snowden revelations, Silicon Valley has begun to invest very heavily in encryption to a degree that was not true when the only thing that was at risk was our personal data, our banking information, and the money in our bank accounts. At that point, Silicon Valley couldn't give a toss. But now that their own business model is under attack, they can't invest enough in encryption technologies. But this is always going to be, as I said, a cat and mouse game.
Thank you. I have to bring it to close that. I want to thank you all very much for coming. I hope we've whetted your appetite for the second in the series coming later this year. I ask you to please join me in thanking Nigel.